My husband's Delulu coworker is convinced they're having an affair, and now she is claiming he got her pregnant, but there's no way he's the father. My name is Vanessa. I'm 36 years old, a mother of 4, and the wife of a man I once believed nothing in this world could shake his love for me. My husband's name is Ethan. He works as a senior manager in the marketing department of a large media corporation. We met when I was still an employee at the same company. But after giving birth to our second child, I left my position and shifted to freelance work so I could spend more time caring for our family. Ethan stayed, and he kept climbing the ladder. He was the kind of husband many women admired. We lived in a modest but cozy house in the suburbs. Our life wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful. Or at least I used to think so. I used to believe that if a woman lived right, loved deeply, and gave enough of herself, then happiness would be a guaranteed outcome. But I was wrong. Because there are people out there who don't respect boundaries, who can't tell what's real and what's imagined. And there are those who are willing to destroy a family simply because they believe it's destiny. Her name was Aria, 28 years old, a new hire in the events department. And within 6 months of joining the company, she nearly turned my entire world upside down. I still remember the first time I met Aria. It was at the company's Christmas party. She was petite, with softly curled brown hair, dressed modestly, but her eyes were as sharp as a blade. She smiled a lot, spoke gently, but her gaze never left Ethan the entire night, as if everyone else in the room simply ceased to exist. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I used to work in that environment. I knew how new hires often tried to build connections. I wasn't the jealous type. But then, small signs began to add up. Until one day, it all exploded with a single wrong photo sent. That night, I was washing dishes and casually checking my husband's phone. Not because I was suspicious. We often used each other's phones. It was just a routine. Setting up appointments, sharing podcasts, texting our kids' teachers. But that night, a new message popped up from an unsaved number. No words, no caption, just a photo. The woman in the picture wore a sheer red lace nightgown. The dim lighting made everything appear more provocative. She stood in front of a mirror, arms wrapped across her chest, her head tilted, eyes locked directly on the camera. Below the photo was a short message. Oops, wrong person. I wasn't shocked. I wasn't even jealous. What I felt first was confusion. The woman in the picture wasn't a stranger. It was Aria. After that night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I doubted my husband, but because I couldn't understand how a woman could look me in the eyes, walk into my home, and shamelessly hand me fabricated evidence without so much as a flicker of hesitation. I lay next to Ethan in silence. He held me like always. The same arms, the same breath, the same heartbeat I knew so well. But in my head, questions spun like a storm. What did Aria want? Why Ethan? Why me? And how could she be so certain that she could wedge herself into our family? I didn't say anything to Ethan that night. But the next morning, I started digging. I reached out to an old friend named Natalie. She used to work at the same company but had since moved on. I asked her about Aria. Natalie hesitated, then admitted she didn't know much. Only that Aria had been hired through the referral of a senior manager in the events team, someone she seemed personally connected with. Natalie told me that when Aria first started, everyone thought she was sweet, enthusiastic. But after a few months, some coworkers started to complain that she would sneak photos during meetings, stay late at the office even when there was nothing urgent. And most noticeably, she asked about Ethan. A lot. I felt a chill run down my spine. My husband once told me that he felt something was off about Aria, but he couldn't quite explain what. Now, I was starting to see what he couldn't put into words. She wasn't just sending photos. She was slowly constructing a story, one detail at a time. A narrative that, if I wasn't careful, could cast me as the villain without me even realizing it. A few days later, Ethan came home early. He told me he had spoken to HR about Arya's behavior and that they said they would look into it. I asked if he'd ever been alone with her. He said no, all their meetings had witnesses. But then he paused and finally told me about something that happened. There was one time after a weekend meeting when everyone had left early. Ethan was gathering his materials when Arya came back, saying she'd forgotten her phone. When it was just the two of them in the room, she walked closer and asked if he wanted to have lunch with her. Ethan declined, firmly but politely. Arya didn't react. She simply smiled and said, "That's okay. You'll change your mind eventually." Ethan recounted the moment calmly, but I could see something unsettled in his eyes. He wasn't afraid of her, but he was afraid of what she might be capable of. Because after he said no, she didn't back off. If anything, she seemed to be stepping in deeper. A week later, Arya sent Ethan an email. From her official work address this time. The subject line read, "Confidential HR matter." In the email, she wrote that she felt emotionally hurt because Ethan was ignoring her, and that she was considering filing a complaint for what she described as unprofessional coldness. She hinted that if Ethan would just agree to meet with her once, everything could be resolved privately. Ethan forwarded the email to HR. They said they'd handle it. But I knew. Arya had entered a new phase. This was no longer harmless flirting. This was psychological coercion, a calculated form of emotional manipulation. A few days later, while I was picking up the kids from school, I received a phone call from an unfamiliar number. I answered. Her voice was soft, like silk. She told me I deserved to know the truth. That Ethan was living a double life. That I was being deceived. She said she had proof. Much more than I imagined. I didn't argue. I just hung up. But something inside me snapped like a live wire. Arya had crossed the line. She was no longer just circling Ethan's professional life. She had stepped into our private world. Ethan started showing signs of exhaustion. He came home later some nights. He told me not to worry, that work was stressful. But I knew he was hiding something. Not because he was guilty, but because he was trying to protect me. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, I walked into Ethan's office. On his desk was a stack of printed messages, private messages from Arya stored on the company's internal system. She wrote to him as if they were lovers, using romantic, intimate language, like excerpts from a poorly written romance novel. But Ethan had never replied. Not once. He sat silently while I read them. Then he whispered that he had been collecting evidence, that he wouldn't let her destroy everything we had built. I nodded. But inside, I began to feel fear. Not fear of Arya, but fear of what might happen if this spiraled any further out of control. I tried to keep life normal, taking the kids to school, cooking, working, but the tension never left. Every time the phone rang, I jumped. Every time I heard a car stop outside, I rushed to check the door. Ethan was deteriorating too. He couldn't sleep. He became irritable over small things. I knew he was trying to shield me, but I also knew he was trapped in a psychological game he never signed up for. And then, it happened. One evening, we were all sitting at the dinner table when there was a knock on the door. Ethan got up to answer it. A man we didn't recognize stood outside and handed him an envelope. Inside was a letter. It wasn't addressed to the company. It wasn't sent to HR. It was sent directly to our home, signed by Arya. It was a statement, detailing the relationship she claimed to have had with Ethan. She wrote about late-night meetings, emotional texts, and even said the real reason Ethan married me was just to maintain appearances. I read every single line and my chest tightened with each word. Not because I believed it, but because I couldn't comprehend how someone could fabricate such vivid, elaborate, and utterly delusional lies. Ethan stood beside me, his face pale. I noticed his hands shaking. In that moment, I knew he wasn't just angry or exhausted anymore. He was afraid. No one wants to believe they could get caught in something like this. A silent war, unpredictable, uncontrollable. But we were already inside it, and Arya wasn't stopping. She had written a script, a complete storyline, step by step. And in that story, I was just a secondary character, the naive wife, the disposable one, the woman who would eventually be replaced by the one who truly understood him. Ethan said he wouldn't let it go on. He was going to demand a formal internal investigation. He was going to bring the truth into the light. I believed him. But I also knew something else. Sometimes the truth isn't enough. Not when someone is determined to believe in their own fantasy. What I didn't expect was that just 1 week later, Arya would show up again. This time, at my front door, smiling, with one hand resting gently on her belly. Her stomach was visibly rounded. She said she was pregnant, and that Ethan was the father. I thought I had mentally prepared myself for anything. Creepy messages, seductive photos, anonymous letters, even psychological threats. But nothing compared to the moment I stood frozen at my front door, staring at Arya smiling, her hand gently resting on a clearly rounded belly beneath her loose blouse. She was well dressed, her hair straightened neatly. There was no trace of chaos or instability. On the contrary, she looked composed. Eyes clear, voice soft and steady, like every word she spoke was a self-evident truth. I stood still, the late afternoon breeze chilling my skin despite the sun still shining. In my head, something was screaming that this couldn't be real, that it was absolutely absurd. And yet, there she was, speaking as if we were old friends sharing a deeply personal moment. She said she had stayed silent long enough, that she didn't want to break up my family, but because of the baby, she could no longer keep quiet. She hoped I would understand. She hoped I would open my heart so the three of us could raise this child in love. I was speechless, completely numb. Ethan was inside the house. By the time he came to the door, Arya had already turned away, leaving behind a small envelope. Inside was an ultrasound image. No mother's name, no exam date, just a blurry black and white photo like millions of others. But on the back, scrawled in messy handwriting, were the words, "For the father, with all my love." Ethan froze when I showed him. He immediately denied it, said it was impossible, that he had never touched her, not once since she was hired, that the two of them had never even been alone for more than 10 minutes. I believed him, partly because I knew him, and partly because the timeline made no sense. If she was really pregnant, she would have had to conceive before she ever started working with Ethan, which meant the baby simply couldn't be his. But the absurdity of it didn't comfort me, because the issue wasn't about facts. The issue was this. Arya believed the story she had created. She lived in a version of reality where she was the chosen one, the leading lady, the woman carrying the child of the man she loved. And when someone believes something deeply enough, for long enough, they'll do anything to protect that belief, even if it never happened. Ethan immediately reported everything to HR and the company's legal department. An official investigation was launched. Messages, emails, work logs, all collected. An emergency internal meeting was held, and Arya was suspended pending review. But I knew that suspension wouldn't stop her. People like Arya didn't crave jobs. They craved attention, relevance, a place in someone else's life. And if they're pushed out, they'll only try harder to force their way back in. Just as I feared, 3 days later, Arya showed up at my in-laws' house. My mother-in-law called me, her voice shaking. Arya had knocked on their door and introduced herself as the mother of Ethan's unborn child. She said she wanted the family to accept the baby as one of their own. Despite knowing the full story, my in-laws were stunned. They didn't believe her, but they also didn't want to provoke her. They stayed calm, told her they'd take it under consideration, then gently asked her to leave. But as soon as she was gone, my mother-in-law called me in a panic. It was the first time in my life I'd ever heard her say she was afraid of another woman. We started to feel real fear, not just emotionally, but for the safety of our children. I spoke with the school, gave security Arya's photo, told them no one besides me or Ethan was authorized to pick up our kids. We installed more cameras around the house. Every night before bed, I checked and rechecked every door. I locked them 3 times. It felt like we were living in a psychological thriller. But I didn't find it dramatic. I just felt tired, angry. How could someone from the outside infiltrate our life so deeply, planting fear, doubt, and paranoia into a home that used to feel safe? I started losing sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured Arya standing at my door, cradling her belly, smiling, eyes dreamy. Sometimes I could even hear her voice in my head. Gentle, sweet, but laced with quiet threat. Ethan wasn't doing any better. He became withdrawn, quiet, jumpy. Once while driving, he murmured aloud, wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was something he'd forgotten. Some moment he had slipped. A forgotten encounter. I looked at him, and for the first time, I saw fear in my husband's eyes. Not fear of Arya, but fear of being doubted, even when he'd done nothing wrong. I hugged him and told him I didn't doubt him. But I also admitted something that scared me. Arya had shaken me. Not because I believed her, but because I no longer knew what to believe at all. When someone can fabricate a story so convincingly, how could I be sure that anything I was living was still real? Arya didn't just attack my marriage. She attacked my reality. And that was more terrifying than any lie she could ever tell. 1 week later, she came back. This time, she didn't knock. She walked straight into our backyard where we were hosting a small gathering with close friends. She walked through the gate like she belonged there, one hand on her stomach, smiling brightly. Everyone fell silent. She introduced herself as the mother of Ethan's child, then turned to me and said I was a strong woman, and that she hoped the 3 of us could co-parent the baby together. I stood up, walked toward her, and told her firmly she had no right to be here. Ethan followed close behind. His voice sharpened. For the first time since all of this began, he didn't hold back. He told Arya that she was delusional, that he had never touched her, that the child she carried could not be his, and that if she ever came near our home again, we would get the law involved. Arya went still, and in that moment, I saw something flicker in her eyes, as if, for the very first time, the fantasy inside her mind was starting to crack. But then, she turned and walked away. No tears, no rage, just silence. Like everything was still unfolding, exactly the way she had written it. I never thought I'd have to say the words DNA test in the context of my own marriage. But after everything that had happened, after all of Arya's appearances, the whispered claims that the baby in her belly is my husband's, I knew that without something definitive, none of us would ever have peace. It wasn't that I doubted Ethan. I just needed an objective truth. Something that would silence all assumptions, all gossip, all skeptical looks, when everything we were dealing with stemmed from the delusions of an unstable woman. Ethan agreed the moment I brought up the test. Not even a second of hesitation. He wanted to end this. He wanted to prove to me, clearly and definitively, that he had never strayed, never betrayed the family we had built. We contacted a lawyer. They told us that paternity testing could only be done after the baby was born, unless the mother cooperated beforehand. But with Arya, that was impossible. She refused any form of prenatal testing. She claimed it wasn't necessary, that she knew who the father was. She said we were just trying to deny a truth that couldn't stay hidden forever. Our family felt frozen in limbo. Week after week passed, and Arya's belly grew more visibly pregnant. She no longer came to our house, but she kept appearing in unexpected places. Outside my children's school, at the corner store near our home, or walking past Ethan's office building as if by coincidence. We reported her to the police. They documented the situation but said that unless she directly threatened us or trespassed, they couldn't issue a restraining order just yet. It was like we were caught in a psychological war. Every move she made sat perfectly between legal and unhinged, just enough to drive us crazy, but never enough to spark legal action. I started having anxiety attacks. Every time the doorbell rang, my heart pounded in my chest. I checked the security cameras every night before bed. I no longer slept deeply. I no longer dreamed. All that was left inside me was a constant, simmering alertness. The baby was born in mid-June. Arya didn't inform us, but one of her cousins, Wayne, reached out on his own. Wayne was the only one in her family who believed Arya was living in a fantasy world. He called Ethan and said the baby had arrived. It was a girl, and he promised he would try to convince Arya to agree to a DNA test. I sat next to Ethan during that call, my hand tightly gripping his. For the first time in months, I saw a flicker of light in his eyes. Not hope, but relief. That maybe, finally, there was a way out of this maze. A week later, Wayne brought Arya and the baby to a private clinic where we had scheduled the test. I let Ethan go alone, accompanied by our lawyer and the supervising doctor. Arya arrived on time. No drama, no scene. She held the baby in her arms, cradling her gently like any normal mother. But what terrified Ethan the most was her eyes. She looked at the baby and whispered, "Daddy's right here." Then turned to Ethan and smiled. A smile without anger, without madness, just pure belief, like everything had already been decided. And we were just wasting our time resisting. The doctor collected the samples, carefully, precisely. Every step was documented. On the way home, Ethan said nothing. He was silent the entire drive. When I looked at him in the rearview mirror, I saw something cracked behind his eyes. Not his trust, but his strength. That night, we sat together in silence. No TV, no dinner, just wine and quiet. We both knew the results would decide not just the truth, but the future of our family. Not because we would fall apart if the child was his, but because if she was, everything we thought we knew about our lives would have to be rewritten. 10 days later, the results came in. I held the paper in my hands, too afraid to open it. Ethan was the one who did. He read the first line, then the second, and then he collapsed onto the table. The result was negative. He was not the father. I let out a deep breath. But what I felt next wasn't relief. It was something else. Something hollow and lingering. Like waking up from a dark dream but not knowing where you're supposed to go next. We gave the results to our lawyer. This time, things were finally clear. We could request a restraining order. We could file a lawsuit for harassment, defamation, and invasion of privacy. But standing before the judge, Ethan looked at me and said he didn't want to do it. Not because he forgave Arya, but because he understood. She didn't need punishment. She needed treatment. We got in touch with Wayne again. He said Arya was back at home under her family's watch. After hearing the results, she didn't explode. She just sat quietly, holding her baby, and whispered, "Everyone's wrong." Wayne consulted with doctors. They advised long-term psychiatric treatment. Her family agreed, and Wayne would temporarily take care of the baby. I listened, not knowing what to feel. Relief that it was over? Compassion for a delusional woman? Or dread that one day when the medication stops working, this nightmare might begin all over again? That night, Ethan and I sat quietly together while the kids slept soundly. Outside, a gentle rain was falling. I found myself wondering, if this had never happened, would I have ever discovered the limits of my endurance? I never screamed. I never smashed anything. I never lashed out. I simply lived through each day, each night, with a heart constantly on guard. And I wondered, how many other women are out there living like this, just because someone else believed they had the right to shatter their peace? We weren't the same versions of ourselves anymore. I was no longer the carefree wife I used to be. Ethan was no longer the man who always came home with a smile. But one thing remained. His hand still reached for mine whenever I went quiet in the middle of the night. His eyes still softened every time he looked at our kids. And every night, when he thought I was asleep, he still whispered, "Thank you for staying." After everything, the most surprising part wasn't the DNA results. It wasn't that Arya had been sent to a treatment center, and it wasn't even the relief of finally being believed. What surprised me most was that I still loved him. Not dramatically, not loudly, but in the quiet way someone chooses to stay after the storm has passed. I thought I'd lose my trust, my innocence, my respect. But I didn't. I was still here. He was still here. And somehow, we were still whole. We decided to sell the house. Not to escape. But because that home had absorbed too much darkness, the times Arya showed up, the sleepless nights, the worried eyes of our children watching me sit frozen in the dark, we moved to a different neighborhood. Quieter, near a park, where the sun felt warmer and green trees lined the streets. The new house was smaller, but it felt infinitely safer. I spent time redecorating everything from scratch, choosing every curtain, every wall color, not to make the place feel new, but to give myself a chance to start over in a space no longer saturated with fear. Ethan began therapy. He didn't tell anyone. Only I knew. He once told me that every night as he lay down, he still saw Arya's eyes, accusing, silent. He didn't hate her, but he was angry at himself for not setting firmer boundaries, for letting her slip into the space between work and home. I didn't blame him, because I was in therapy too. I needed to relearn how to trust. Not just others, but myself. I needed to stop questioning every emotion. Stop thinking that if I had been stronger, more in control, maybe this wouldn't have gone so far. One day, my therapist asked, "If you weren't the victim, just an outsider looking in, would you consider that woman strong?" I broke down, because for the first time, I realized I had survived. Not passively, but by choosing silence when needed, speaking up when it mattered, and holding on to the one thing I couldn't afford to lose: myself. We told the kids our story in ways that fit their ages. They didn't understand everything, but they understood this. No matter what happens, Mom and Dad are still here, still holding hands, still taking them to the park every Sunday afternoon. One day, my oldest daughter asked, "Mom, are you mad at her?" I was quiet. Then I answered, "No, sweetie, I'm not mad. I just feel sorry because sometimes people are in so much pain. They can't tell what's real and what's not anymore." I started writing again. Not about Arya, but about my journey. About the nights I sat in silence with cold tea. About the deep breaths I had to take to keep standing. About the small moments that saved me from falling apart. I didn't write to vent. I wrote to remember. I had walked through a storm, and I was still standing. And sometimes that's all a woman needs to keep going. Wayne kept in touch. He told us Arya was recovering well. She was slowly starting to recognize what was real. There was still a lot of healing ahead, but she had begun cooperating with the doctors. The baby, a beautiful, healthy little girl, was being cared for by Wayne and his wife. They hoped that one day when Arya was ready, she could step into motherhood in the right way. I no longer felt anger when I heard her name. I just felt something I couldn't quite explain. Sadness for what didn't have to happen. For a soul that had lost its way for too long. And for the parts of me that, despite surviving, still hadn't fully healed. I don't know what the future holds, but I know one thing for certain. No one gets to write my story but me. Not Arya. Not the rumors. Not delusional text messages. Only me. That night, Ethan and I stood out on the balcony, looking up at a sky full of stars. He turned to me, said nothing, just placed his hand gently over mine and gave it a soft squeeze. And I smiled. Because after everything, I still had him. And more importantly, I still had myself. I'm telling this story not to gain sympathy, but because if you are lost in a storm right now, I want you to know this. You are not alone. You are not weak for being in pain. You're simply learning how to rise again, just like I did. If you see yourself in this story, stay with us. At her side of the story, this isn't just a storytelling channel. This is a space where you are heard, where you are understood. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. Don't forget to subscribe, turn on the bell, and if you have a story that needs to be told, we're always here to listen. Because here at her side of the story, every story is a living testimony, and every woman deserves to be told in her own voice.